Very, very nice. Thank you, Michael, for those wonderful words. And I also want to thank you for quoting extensively from the book. Hold on a second while I cross out some of these sections of my speech. No. That's okay. And thank you all for being here with the weather as it is outside. A lot of familiar faces, a lot of friendly faces. Some of them I think know what I'm going to say. But let me start by saying that back in 2005, I published a book called The New Left, in which I described what I called the most important force within politics in America, a coalition I defined as the self-interested left, or the public sector union, social service, advocacy, industrial complex. I had been observing the New Left for more than a decade, going all the way back to a 1994 story I wrote for Crane's New York Business, and Alaire Townsend, who was my publisher at the time, and who took all the heat for me saying things back then that I'm going to say now, but were completely politically incorrect back then. How many people did we have cancel subscriptions? There were many, I remember that. But I'd been saying these things for more than a decade, and I had realized that this group had become the most significant coalition in state and local politics in many places. And by 2005, what I realized was the truth of Tip O'Neill's famous observation that all politics is local, because the power that this new big government coalition was gathering gave them enormous resources and gradually was making them players in national politics too. 2004, for instance, the election in 2004 was perhaps the first time that this coalition, led by enormous contributions from public unions, government worker unions nationwide, and by grassroots work such as voter registration drives by groups like ACORN, had actually made an impact on the national election that was really visible. Now, some of the critics of the book dismissed it as alarmism. What they said is that, I mean, after all, conservatives, depending upon your definition of a conservative, controlled the White House, and they also controlled both houses of Congress at the time. So, I mean, how powerful could this new left actually be? Now, I thought the critics were underestimating this new coalition, but even I would not have been foolish enough back then to predict that within 3 years, we would have had a former community activist in the White House, and that whole parts of the new left agenda would now be advanced in Washington as part of federal policy. What is the new left and where did it come from? I call it the self-interested left because it is always for bigger government and more programs and more spending. Even more spending on programs that have failed miserably, because this coalition benefits always from a growing public sector. The coalition was created in part by the architects of the war on poverty, who believed somewhat naively that government could rapidly eliminate poverty and revive declining neighborhoods by spending billions of tax dollars on local community groups, creating a constellation of new programs, most of them completely untested. What the war on poverty planners did create through this money was something almost entirely new. Local community groups headed by activists who existed entirely off of government money. The war on poverty also transformed many traditional charities, as Michael told you, which previously had used private donations to offer the poor a hand up. Instead, they were transformed, many of them, into government contractors who adapted the ideology of the war on poverty, which saw the poor as victims of an unjust system. Some of the programs financed by the war on poverty were really nothing more than tax-financed community activism. That is, vague programs that use tax dollars to help people become more politically influential, under the notion that those who advocate for themselves somehow benefit from this community work. Not surprisingly, the people who formed and ran these programs quickly became politically active themselves because they rapidly realized that they needed leverage to keep the money flowing, the government money, that is. By the late 1980s, nearly 20% of the New York City Council were products of this government-funded nonprofit sector, and they were among the most strident advocates for higher taxes and more government spending. In other cities, too, from Chicago to Cleveland to Los Angeles, the road to electoral success increasingly ran through the government-funded social services sector. Spending directed to these groups boomed through both Republican and Democratic administrations. The nonprofit service sector has never been richer or more powerful, wrote former welfare recipient Teresa Funicello in a 1993 book called The Tyranny of Kindness. Except to the poor, today poverty is a mega business. Now, from the very beginning, there were few controls on how this money was spent, and today, 40 years later, much of the money goes to fund programs with no track record of success. The Community Development Block Grant Program, to which I devote a chapter because I think it's symbolic of the problem, has spent some $120 billion in its history with little to show for it in many places, even though its original goal was to alleviate poverty and revive communities. To take one example of how the program cavalierly uses taxpayer money, after the 1992 Los Angeles riots, the CDGB gave the city $14 million in grants to help address, quote, the underlying causes of the riots. Now, since no one could even agree what those causes were, the city simply gave the money to community groups it was already funding. And a subsequent audit by the General Accounting Office disclosed that the city didn't even know how most of the money had been spent. Similarly, the federal government and states have invested billions in financing job training programs run by politically connected social service groups that really know little about how to find people jobs. That's one reason why these programs have a dismal placement rate. That's not surprising because the money is really meant as a jobs program for nonprofits. A GAO audit of the federal government's key placement program found that only about 40% of the money designated for retraining workers actually went to the workers themselves, while administrative costs took up the rest. Now, our president ran just such a group existing off federal grants, which was started by a coalition of churches in Chicago, but which was designed to live mostly off government money, not contributions from parishioners, or even donations from private foundations. It was just this kind of group that you would head if you had political ambitions and wanted to make the right connections. This group of government-funded social service activists soon found natural allies in another group, namely one of the biggest and most important political forces in this country today, public sector unions, which got their start in the late 1950s as politicians like New York City Mayor Robert Wagner decided to grant government workers the right to unionize as a way of making them political allies. Previously, government workers had been denied that right on the grounds that they were already protected by civil service and because government was a monopoly without any competition to restrain unreasonable wage and benefit demands. Now, quickly, the fears of many critics about public unionization came to pass. For those who remember, the 1960s were a very tumultuous time in this field. In 1966 alone, teacher strikes shut down in September of that year some 36 major urban school systems around America. Now, what happened is states quickly began limiting the right to strike by public employees, and unions figured that they needed a new strategy, which involved becoming politically active in state legislatures and in city councils. And to take one example of how quickly the evolution happened, in California in the 1970s, the most influential groups in Sacramento were private industry associations run by groups like the trial lawyers, doctors and hospitals, and insurance companies. By the mid-1980s, the biggest donors to political campaigns and the biggest spenders on lobbying dollars in Sacramento had become groups like the Teachers Union, the Servers Employees International Union, and the Public Safety Workers Unions, namely police and fire. Tellingly, these public sectors unions garnered the most power in states that were economically vibrant at the time, places like California, New York, New Jersey, and Illinois. This wasn't a coincidence. As states prospered, the opportunity they afforded people attracted population, which required government to grow bigger to accommodate newcomers. At the same time, prosperity brought with it higher standards of living. And as living standards rise, people inevitably begin to ask more services from government.